Good evening and hello, everyone. Tonight, speaking to you, I am Kavita Pipalia, the president of the California Association of the Deaf. A quick image description is that I am sitting in a room with a black curtain behind me. I am wearing a blue blouse. I have short hair. And I have an I love you symbol inside of a locket, a heart-shaped locket with white and red. I do have earrings on, I have lipstick on, and my nails are done. I'd like to take this opportunity tonight to welcome each and every one of you to tonight's webinar. Before we begin, I'd like to cover some housekeeping. We are currently sending out 2 live streams, one on Facebook and the other on YouTube. The viewers at both sites will be able to watch our amazing presenter, who will be introduced soon. Anybody in the audience, if you'd like to ask a question to our presenter, type your question into the comment box. If you're in Facebook, the Facebook comment box. If you're on YouTube, type it into the YouTube comment box. Michelle, the CAD secretary, and Dr. Marla Hattrick and myself will work to take those questions and forward them to our presenter tonight so that they can respond to your questions. Any questions or comments that are insults or offensive will be removed from Facebook and YouTube. Please enjoy the evening. And now I will pass it on to Dr. Marla Hattrick to introduce our guest speaker. And Dr. Marla Hattrick is our CAD Commission Deputy Chair and has been working with the webinars this season. Marla? This is Dr. Marla Hattrick speaking. Good evening, folks. I am Marla Hattrick. I'll give a quick image description. I am blonde with my hair in a tail. I'm wearing black glasses. I have silver dangly earrings with a silver necklace. I have a lime green sweater on with a white blouse underneath. Behind me is a wall with a portion of a map of China that is visible. And then to my side is a bookshelf with a couple family pictures and books. We are extremely honored to introduce our speaker for tonight, and that is Kari Cooke. Kari's name sign is K on the shoulder. And before I get there, and I always forget, I'd like to thank our interpreter, our captioner that are also here working tonight with us. So I'd like to thank them for the work they've done in our series and covering those shows. Tonight is the final webinar of the series for this year. A new series will begin in the fall when we have our CAD conference on the 28th to the 30th. That CAD symposium will restart our webinars again. So let me introduce you tonight to Kari Cooke. I'm honored to present her to you tonight because she is a champion of the deaf community in DC, working with the city council. She works at the Office of the Deaf, Deafblind, and Hard of Hearing at the DC Mayor's office. That office was put in place, and I remember being very impressed with the group that had that momentum and continued the work. Then the DC mayor ended up hiring Kari Cooke, and I do have relatives that worked on that. And now Kari's been in the position almost a year now, is it, Kari? Kari responding, it will be a year in 2 weeks, definitely. And this is Dr. Hattrick. What an honor, Kari, to have you here. And so I invite the audience also to welcome Kari Cooke for our final in the series webinar. For our last hurrah, it's very fitting that we have Kari with us. And Kari, the platform is yours. This is Kari speaking. Thank you, Marla, Dr. Marla Hattrick. Thank you so much for introducing me and welcoming me to the webinar tonight. I am so excited to be here. I will also give an image description of myself. I am a Black woman. I have brown skin. I have matching glasses, and I'm wearing pink lipstick. I have black dreadlocks, which are shoulder length. I am wearing a blue blouse, and I have a pearls necklace, and I have matching earrings that match my necklace. In my background, I'm sitting at home, so you see a white wall behind me. I am sitting on a chair. But the chair has a fur decoration overlaid. It's something to keep me warm. Okay, that's about it for me. So to get into my presentation, hello everyone. I'm excited here to share and talk about an issue that is very precious to us, and that is political participation, civic engagement. Something that's really key for me is involving folks, involving different ways to participate in civic engagement, and it can take on many forms. For some people, it can be in the form of voting, and that's a simple form. For other people, it can be protest, activism, and such. For others, it can be reaching out to their elected representatives and making contact and informing them about the issues and concerns and needs of the community, and then being repetitive with those efforts. There are definitely many avenues for you to become civically engaged. And the most powerful way to engage is civic engagement, which relates to organizing. One person, I'm sure, can make an impact, but a group of people who are organized with a sustained effort is powerful. We know that the power is with the people. There is power in coming together to work together as a group in a communal effort. That's what works. So I'd like to share a little bit about the community and politics, policy, and participation. I have a couple notes to share about me in my presentation. And then after that, we will have the US Central Matter model of participation, which difference is different from the way that people from third world countries engage in government. Uh, my focus will be on the continental United States with my examples. So access can be different things. There are multiple different disabilities, and disabilities vary. I will be sharing a lot of information, so I'll make sure to check in and make sure that you're caught up. My PowerPoint will also have some information, but I will not be reading from it. If you'd like a copy of my PowerPoint, go ahead and email me and let me know, please. At the end of the presentation, I will share my email address so you can reach out to me for my PowerPoint if you want full access to that. If you'd like to also access my notes. Okay, so with that said, we'll go ahead and start. I have my agenda here. It's somewhat general. You see, we're starting with an introduction. And then I have disability policy. And I really mean, and welfare programs. So I mean programs that will be started, that have been started by the deaf community. Then I'm going to go ahead and talk about the framework of political engagement, and civic engagement, and the type of impact that it's had on United States policy. And I'm going to try to tie those in together. I'm going to try to tie civic engagement along with impacts on programs and share that for you. I will share current events, current updates with you, and talk about protest or political movements that have happened recently and how we can engage. Next slide. I'm hopeful that by the time we wrap up, folks here that have attended this session will be able to understand the connection between the deaf community, deaf blind community, the disability community, the hard of hearing community, as political constituents and the impact on US policies, and also to share with you how modern day activists use the disability justice model as a framework for policy advocacy. Next slide. Okay. For years in the United States, NAD has been in place. Most of you are familiar with NAD's background, and it really is the first time we see within the deaf community a political constituency. But of course, the impact at those times was limited. The reasons for it, many of us are familiar. At that time, NAD was very white, very male dominated, very middle class, and so on and so on. So the impact wasn't far reaching to the deaf community. It was limited to those who were homogenous to NAD, deaf white males. Deaf blind were marginalized, hard of hearing were marginalized, unless you were a deaf white male. Then there was protest and political action and civic engagement focused on that population of people. When we started seeing more and more communities be involved, more and more deaf communities of the deaf community, people of color, people with other disabilities that are also deaf, like autism, people that are deaf and also wheelchair users, and so on and so on, all the variety of disabilities. People from other countries as well. When you see their groups of marginalized communities, when you see them becoming more and more involved, that's when we saw more of an impact on the deaf community, more of a political movement and a fight for the rights. But that impact and that influence was the impetus for DPN now, Deaf President Now, and for more inclusion of the deaf community. I want to share about the month of April. It is Deaf History Month. But in the past, before that, it was a month when most activism happened. One example, we have disability community political identity. What is a political identity? For example, we have Third World Liberation Front. We have the Poor People's Campaign. We have Operation. And the interpreter missed that. So, talking about Third World Liberation Front, I want to explain what that is. That is when people of color from a variety of communities protest and fight for specific universities access to high schools, employment, and so on and so on. It includes the not just European historical perspective. It also includes Chicanos studies, Black studies, Filipino studies, Indigenous studies. It was a push to include that in the curriculum so that everyone had parity for the higher ed system, as well as the elementary schools, high schools, and so on and so on. So that way we can include all people's entire history. That again is known as the Third World Liberation Front. And that was in April of 1968. So yeah, so that was a part of the movement, or one of the movements. Movements aren't done in a day. It takes much longer than that. It takes years of planning, years of progress, years of work to reach impacts. Again, that Third World Liberation Front, considered successful in California, was one of the first states in the United States that adopted and added a supplement to include and incorporate these different categories or populations of people of color in education. April 1968 also marks the inception of the Poor People's Campaign. Most people are familiar with Martin Luther King. And that is most known or associated with civil rights. Martin Luther King is very visible when it came to civil rights and outspoken, and is the most visible name when it comes to civil rights. And also Black women-led civil rights movement. But what's most visible is a man, right? This is the way things happen in our world. Martin Luther King, a very visible figure, was very active in the civil rights movement. Then, when the Civil Rights Act was passed, the next step was coming together, uniting people, bringing them together, people of all sorts of backgrounds, all sorts of races, and different types of gender. Coming together because they shared one thing: poverty. And so the name of that campaign was the Poor People's Campaign. With that campaign, there was a heavy focus on fighting for rights of the working class person. For example, being able to have a free breakfast. Another example, addressing child poverty or childhood poverty in realistic ways, reflecting on perspectives and on people that live perhaps in different regions, maybe rural regions, mountainous regions, considering people from the city that are in poverty. It was addressing those issues, which were real needs. A lot of people are familiar with EBT cards. Other people are familiar with the SSA, Social Security. Those didn't exist at the time. These are some items that the Poor People's Campaign fought for. It was people that weren't wealthy, people that didn't have unlimited funds, but they felt that everyone deserved the right to live life with dignity. They felt everyone had that right. So the Poor People's Campaign focused on that and worked on that. They had a big march and took over the front lawn of the White House. Martin Luther King, uh, and people from all over the world convened on the White House in support and to fight for these very necessary items for their kids to have food, so that senior citizens wouldn't have to decide between eating another day or paying a bill, those types of issues. And that really began in 1968 in April. Operation Interpreter missed it. Duty. Operation Duty in 3. That was during a protest that was having. We had to make sure that support services existed for veterans returning from the military, veterans who had disabilities, so that they could have access. And something big during that time was all bills passed with working class people not receiving benefits of production, but those who were wealthy and were in production were reaping benefits. So there was sensation in the community where they felt disconnected from professional organizations and civics, and deaf people felt they did not have a voice at the table. People with disabilities or that were deaf were feeling ignored or invisible. And people were speaking about how there are physical barriers to meetings that exclude people in wheelchairs, people that are deaf blind, people that have mental health care issues, and they were experiencing disparities at all at the same time. And it all connected how? With the Poor People's Campaign, with the Third World Liberation Front, and with Operation Dewey and the deaf community, who put a heavy emphasis on deaf rights, rights of people of color, where they all came together and fought together. That's Operation Dewey Canyon. Now, one thing I want to point out about all these different bills, and I will show in the next slide. Next slide. There we go. All the activism, all these groups that came together to work on this movement for their rights, including the veterans that were coming back from the military, Operation Dewey Canyon, working with the Third World Liberation Front and with the Poor People's Campaign. All that work ultimately led to policy, bills, laws, everything related to employment. So the Rehab Act of 1973 really is related to employment. It makes sure that there's equal access to employment. The EHA IDEA Section 504 of 1975 predates the Americans with Disabilities Act, with a bigger focus on education. And then, of course, we have the ADA in 1990, which really focused on education and employment. And you see that as a recurring theme: education, employment. Education, employment. Now, next to where it says policy on the slide, I have another section that says welfare programs. And as you can see there, it's got Voc Rehab, Centers for Independent Living, SSDI, also Veterans Affairs. All those are programs that focus on supplemental supports for people that are unemployed or can connect you to work or can connect you to independent living centers instead of having to live in a shelter or something similar, or having to live in some type of institution. The focus there was to live independently within your community. So you can see all these impacts by the different community groups led to impacts with the focus on employment and education. But let me ask you to stop and think about it. I want to relate this to the deaf experience. Yes, we are still looking for jobs. There's not enough employment. We know that. Unemployment numbers and statistics for the deaf community are higher than those of the hearing community. We know it. So we are still fighting for jobs. When it comes to education, we know it. We see it. The numbers of deaf people of color in education are low. We know this exists. We are still fighting for these causes. But it's different than access, right? Access is being able to go to the festival, being able to go to the market, being able to find things to buy, being able to go somewhere and enjoy a performance. Except the issue is we don't hear. That's access. Access has nothing to do with jobs, employment, or working. Access has nothing to do with education, but it's access to life, access to be able to enjoy and entertain oneself in life, access to be able to participate in life. Let's say I want to go to, I don't know, let's say I want to go to the movies. Anytime I go to the movies, they're not always going to have captions. I have to go to the movies on that special day when they offer captions. That's an access issue. Let's say I want to go to a play. Let's say I want to see a friend in a play, or maybe we heard about a popular play. Here's a good example, The Color Purple. That's a great play. Let's say I want to go see that play. Before I do that, I need to call ahead of time. I need to explain that I'm deaf through an interpreter. I just can't show up out of the blue if I'm bored one day and I want to go see a play. I can't just make my way over and have access, right? We understand that. Employment and education are important. I agree. But those are a different fight than inclusion and access. Again, on this slide, all you see are bills and laws and programs. It has nothing to do with access. This is again about employment and education. It's not really about access. It really isn't. So, a lot of work has happened. A lot of work has been done in the 60s, in the 50s, and the results were manifest in the 70s, in the 80s, maybe even the 1990s, where we saw success from protests and movements. But with all that said, we are aware and we are very cognizant of the fact that the fight still exists. This is why we need to have civic engagement, because we still need more. Especially if the target is equity. There is quite a bit more left. Next slide, please. Next slide. So, you see on my slide the words a luta, and members of the ADA, a generation quicker, fought for the ADA. And for example, with that, we have people in California, Northern California, got together for a protest to fight to have the right as a person with disability, any type of disability, to access. But that fight took years. It took decades. The ADA passed after the Deaf President Now situation happened, and it's true. Now, why did that happen? Because with Deaf President Now, and the ADA's roots go as far back to it, people woke up to the fact that, of course, Gallaudet wasn't too far from DC, from Congress, and from the Senate. And so when the students at Gallaudet had the campus takeover, that caused some interest, and people realized and saw the burning passion and the anger at the inequities and saw that sign language. And a lot of those people said, hey, as a Black hearing person, I experienced that discrimination too. And they saw some similarities. Maybe a hearing woman saw something and said, I see something similar that I experienced too. So through the Deaf President Now event, we were able to connect with other individuals that were suffering oppression. And those folks understood the gist of the fight. And that allowed people to focus. And that's very interesting. And that's something about the ADA that I notice people rarely talk about. The ADA began with activism of civic engagement with the Deaf President Now movement. And that endured for years and years. But it wasn't until senators, congressmen, and the president themselves, President Bush, when they finally decided to do something, it was after Deaf President Now, because Deaf President Now gave them something to connect their experience with, for them to understand that the struggle for rights and the struggle to have access is the same as what deaf people were going to. And so you see that there's a lot of sign-on from a lot of civil rights people, like, for example, Jesse Jackson and others who wrote letters of support, Al Sharpton and other people wrote letters of support to support DPN Now. They wanted to support DPN Now, and they said the deaf community deserved a deaf president at Gallaudet, since they'd never had one for years. But the reason they were supportive is because they had that epiphany when they realized we're fighting the same fight, the fight for access. And people were finally able to see individuals with disabilities as political constituents. That's another important result of Deaf President Now. Before that, people with disabilities were looked at as strange, odd. But with Deaf President Now, people saw the empowerment to the community. They understood the sensations and the feelings, right? Not everyone understood it. Most people did. But some deaf people say, I don't have a disability. I don't see myself as disabled. I don't count myself in that category. But the disability community and civil rights exist because of deaf people. We need to let go of our disability identity. We need to have our leadership, our role in recognizing that it has made disability acts and rights happen. A lot of deaf people want to disconnect from the disability community. And at the same time, that ignores deaf people with disabilities. There are deaf people that have disabilities too. There are deaf people with physical disabilities. There are people that are deaf and have sensory disabilities, deaf and deaf-blind, and so on and so on. All those are categories of disability. Deafness is also a disability. There are people with deafness and developmental disabilities. All of those people need a voice. All these groups of people have rights and they have something to say. And the deaf community by disassociating from the disability community, shuts their voices and quiets their voices. When we get power from coming together, we get power from unity. And that's the disability model. Before, we were thinking and talking about disability as equality. Now, disability is a justice issue. With disability as a justice issue, that allows us to think about disability as an identity, as something we can be proud of. But at the same time, it also means that we can be vulnerable with that identity. I can say, I have depression too. I'm deaf and I have autism. One can say that. It allows us to be open and transparent with our identity because there shouldn't be any shame attached to our identity. There shouldn't be any sense of uncomfort attached to identity. There shouldn't be a sense of having to hide things from people to know. Instead, when it comes to identity, there should be nothing but pride. I am a deaf person and I have rights. I am deaf and I have this disability and I have rights and I deserve them just like everyone else. When we talk about disability justice, we are talking about a world where it's not about access, but instead the entire system is set up to be inclusive. It's a world where the entire system is set up where at the last minute, I can go to a movie and it has captions already ready. Where at the last minute, I can go to a street festival and I could see a stage performance with music and dancing, and there's already an interpreter on the stage without me having to call ahead of time, without me having to say, I'll be there and I need an interpreter. I don't need, we need to build a system in a world where that's unnecessary, where anywhere you go, access is automatically present and exists. We need to build a world and a system where it's not an afterthought, where there's no excuse like, well, if we have the budget, then we'll pay for interpreters. That's not the type of world and system we need. For example, if you go to the Department of Motor Vehicles, they should have a CART person to be ready to provide captions so that we can walk in and say, hi, I need to write notes back and forth, or I need captions. The representative at the Department of Motor Vehicles should have a device that they're ready to type back and forth with you. If you're hard of hearing, they should have a device that you can read from when you have your conversation. If you're deaf, the DMV should have sign language services ready to support you when you show up. And the only way that we're going to make and create a world and a system like this is through civic engagement, by getting involved. It's not only about, oh, I'm fighting for getting an office set up. Okay, that's fine. You can set up what you want at your office. But let's say we want to go to a bar and we want to see captions on every TV. Why can't that be done? It's free and simple. If I go to a bar, there should be captions on TV. I enjoy sports too, right? Don't you? It's not about having a fight for one accommodation, one piece of access where we're constantly fighting. This is why it's important that changes like this are a part of a movement. It's not about someone saying, oh, I want to fight for this one thing and then stop. Because it's not about an individual. It's about a collective. It's about the entire community. So that's the important part of civic engagement. I hope that I've convinced you to think about being involved and participating in the political process. And not just being limited to, well, I'm running for office or I'm trying to get votes, but instead it's really joining that fight for justice. Next slide, please. That's about it. That's me. My email is on the screen. You can see moddhh at dc.gov. My name is Kari Cooke. Email me if you'd like a copy of the slides or if you have something to share. If you have any history about disability rights, any conversation about civic engagement, deaf and hard of hearing, deaf blind, any role as a political constituent as a deaf individual, reach out to me. But now I will pass it back to Dr. Marla Hattrick, for Q&A comments. And I appreciate folks here. I'm very interested in learning from you, seeing your perspective and hearing your comments too. Thank you. Dr. Marla Hattrick speaking. Hello again, folks. Kari, what a fabulous job. I really like it when I learn new information. And I think, Kari, you are right. The deaf president now was the impetus for ADA to pass. I had never connected those two. But of course, deaf people had a right in creating, had a part in creating that momentum. Really cool. Well, I have a long list of questions that are ready to be asked. Let me make sure that I can see the questions. Okay, first question. I've got a list going here, but the first question says, Kari, you mentioned that organized activism is better than people working individually. We are familiar with that, and of course that makes sense. But let me ask you, how can groups now work together to engage in legislative activities? So basically, the question is, how can we do another deaf president now? Because it seems like our organizations are very siloed at the moment. What would you recommend for us to create some unity so that we could have another quote unquote deaf president now movement? This is Kari speaking. Honestly, I'm very forward, very honest. Right now, there are a lot of activism and a lot of movements happening currently, a lot. But if we want to come together and be unified, that means that we need to accept. Let me back up a bit. When I use the term we, I mean people with degrees in professional classes, white people, men. Those people need to accept becoming followers. The grassroots movements need to become leaders, and we need to follow. Women need to lead. Trans females need to lead. I will follow. People of color need to lead. I will follow. We have to fight with those that have the most invested for change to happen. Those that deserve to get those rights. For a long time, I have noticed being involved in a variety of organizations, mostly NBDA, of course, National Black Deaf Advocates. And I have noticed people in general, the deaf community, deaf, blind, hard of hearing, and so on, in general, they do look up to the professional class deaf person, those who have degrees, those who have training, right? And they say, okay, we'll just follow these people. However, I want to caution against that. First of all, people, and I include myself in this, I'm included in this category, people that have moved on with higher education or have these positions, we are okay. We are the ones that are benefiting from the current system. We're fine. So, are we invested in breaking down and changing the system? Possibly not. The people that benefit the most, right, from this current system won't survive it if it's changed, right? So, that's why we need other folks to lead it. We need to let go of our privilege. We need to let go of our microphones, and we need to hand them over. Hand them over to the community so that we can listen. Have the community tell us how they want us to show up, and then I'm there. You want me to write something? What do you want me to say? I don't want to write it for you. I want to write something, but you need to tell me what you want to say, and I can tailor that for you. I need the community to guide us. If we refuse to let go of our power and privilege, we won't ever have a united movement. I realize this. The only way to have a united movement is for those of us that are in the positions to let go. And this is Dr. Marla Hattrick speaking. That's a good consideration and a good discussion about those power dynamics and power imbalances or balances. I saw your interview in the Washington Post having to do with education and language deprivation. Kari says, yeah. And this is Dr. Hattrick. And I'm wondering, with your previous discussion, a lot of people themselves who are language deprived aren't able to take the lead. So how can we merge your idea? I get that, says Kari. This is Dr. Hattrick. So how do we merge your recommendations with the community? So you feel that all deaf have a right in that conversation, regardless of their class. Right, says Kari. And this is Dr. Hattrick. I have to say, I agree. I understand. I get it. But what we have to do is work through all the details, work through all the dynamics, to really bring that forward. And I see you, Kari. I see you as someone who can, because I rarely have this type of conversation and discussion with anyone. So I'm extremely impressed at the thought that we can do more of this dialogue. I am thrilled that you presented on this subject tonight. Thank you, Kari. Okay, second question. Second question says, you mentioned in an interview in the Washington Post that you are focused on language acquisition for better education. How can we help with that project? That's a big one for me. It's my pet project too, says Dr. Marla. I focus birth to 3 years of age, language acquisition. So how can we, everyone watching the webinar tonight, how can we help with that project? How can we be invested in it? And this is Kari. That is also a big thing for me. The biggest thing is focusing on early intervention. Early intervention with kids. It's a big thing. We need, and that includes myself, the deaf community as a whole. Okay? The community needs to be comfortable having the conversation with hearing parents that want their kids to be just like them. What this means is we need to become comfortable. The community needs to be comfortable receiving conversation when parents want their child to have a cochlear implant. Instead, we get uncomfortable. Okay? And they want to maybe learn ASL. We get uncomfortable. Let's say they say we want our child to have a hearing aid and use ASL. We need to become comfortable with those folks and those individuals. Currently, the deaf community has a heavy focus on ASL, on PT ASL, on Black ASL. Dr. Marla says, did you just say PT ASL? And this is Kari responding. Oh no, I said PT ASL, Protactile ASL. We need to be comfortable with sign language from other countries. If we don't focus on expanding these areas, then hearing parents will continue in ignorance, and all they will know is what they get from audiologists. Audiologists say things like, oh, you don't need sign language, don't worry about it. If you teach your kids American Sign Language, they won't talk. Don't do that, don't do that. Audiologists are still spreading those messages. Parents are told by audiologists, if you teach your child sign language, they won't talk. And then half the time, those kids are already speaking. So it's silly. But when they hear an audiologist say that, then they say, oh no, we won't teach our child to sign because then our child won't talk. That's what we're fighting against. That perception. So we need to become comfortable and having conversations with hearing people, parents of deaf children, and we need to understand, we need to get it. Parents want their children to be like them. It's a normal desire. It's a normal thing for them to want. So what should we do? We should expose the parents, accept them, and expose them to the deaf community, to the deaf way of doing things. That's a big part of my work. Yes, I work on early intervention, but every event, I'm big on signing and on fun. To see people empowered while signing, I'm big on that. Because I want parents to know that if your kid signs, it doesn't mean that they have a limited life ahead of them. It does not mean that. It means that if they learn signs, their life will be enriched. They will have more. I grew up in an oral program. I grew up mainstreamed, speaking. So when I learned sign language, my life was enriched. I had more. My life felt complete. I was older when I started learning sign language, and I felt better. And then as I lost more of my hearing, I signed even more, and that was around 30. I started learning around 25. But my life feels full with sign language. I finally feel like a complete, full individual when I learned sign language. Before that, I admit, I felt less than. Without signs, I didn't feel like a human being. And that's the story that I share with parents. And I can tell them, you can do the same thing my parents did. They didn't teach me sign language. You can do that. But here I am. My identity as a complete person, as a full person, didn't start till after I learned sign language. My successes in life didn't start before learning sign language. They started after I learned sign language. I was able to get full access to communication when I learned sign language. How can anyone be successful in life without having access? Sure, I could read lips and I was operating somewhat, but my life felt complete when I learned sign language. And I say this to parents all the time. Talking doesn't make you a complete person. Talking is not communication. Communication and talking are two different things. And that is one of the issues related with language acquisition. It's empowering people to understand that they need to make those decisions on their child's language acquisition. And that focus is the parents. This is Dr. Marla. Thank you so much. I see we're running out of time. The next question asks, what made you want to become involved in the work that you do now? This is Kari. Okay, that's such a good question. Honestly, my boss, the mayor. Yeah, the mayor, pretty much. Definitely. Marla says, really? Yeah. I was having a conversation with the mayor and I realized, huh, this is interesting. I thought to myself. It was during an interview. We were communicating. I don't remember what, but I realized I want to really be engaged in DC life. I didn't want to be part of just the disability community, but I thought I should be engaging DC entirely, not just Gallaudet campus, but DC. I should be able to access all of DC in sign language. I realized I want to participate in parades. I want to participate in big events that are taking place in DC. It's the capital. There are fundraisers constantly. We see politicians all over the city all the time attending events. And I thought to myself, I want to attend to these events. And then I realized the deaf community in DC wants to engage in the political life. And DC is one of my favorite places, to be honest with you. There's access, right? I'm not moving. I'm done. I am put. I love DC. I love it. I am here in DC. But at the same time, there's a big part of DC that's not accessible to me. That's why I want to do this job, because the mayor shares my vision. And this is Dr. Marla Hattrick. Really nice, Kari. Nice response there. It looks like we have enough time, so we'll ask the next question. Next question says, you mentioned beautiful and well said. I would love to work with her, says Kavita, our CAD president, our CAD president. So yeah. And Kari says, I did share my email. Yeah, we will connect you. Okay, last question asks about the Poor People's Campaign. It says, you mentioned the Poor People's Campaign, and many deaf people are not aware or aren't familiar with what it is. I am involved with the Poor People's Campaign in California and found out that there are very few people, deaf people, that are involved with this. So I'm wondering, why not get more deaf people that are in the state and throughout the United States? How can we get people like you or myself and push and make an effort to get more deaf people involved? Because it's a golden opportunity to share our voice. This is Kari. I agree with that comment. And you're exactly right. Currently, the Poor People's Campaign continues, and it's really big on being receptive to all marginalized identities, including the deaf identity. Every time I go, I was involved in the Poor People's Campaign in New York, at New York State, when I lived in New York. And every time I went to an event, they had signing interpreters. I didn't have to tell them ahead of time before going, because they really want deaf people to engage. I was a member, and then the interpreter would show up. If I would show up, the interpreter was there. They were already ready. Whenever I showed up, randomly, yeah, they want deaf people to be involved. I know a person in Iowa that participates. They're a deaf leader at the Poor People's Campaign, and that's in Iowa. And I know a couple others. But you're right, there's very few. And to be honest, it's because people aren't aware of it. That's why there's very few. Deaf people don't know. I think if we shared our experiences more, we would know about it. And if we were more loud about getting people to join us. And so that's what we're fighting for right now. They're fighting for standards. Because honestly, Our needs as the deaf community are exactly the same in most ways because we are the most impacted by poverty. We are the ones that are most impacted by it. So the Poor People's Campaign is fighting for a lot of similar things that we're fighting for equity. For example, fighting for reproductive justice and so on. All of that has to do with poverty. It all does. Everything, almost every issue that exists relates to poverty. So I feel like if more people knew who's currently involved, right, then more people could also become involved and have that experience. When I talk about the Poor People's Campaign, they're not just focused on one thing. They have subgroups as well. They have areas of interest. So if you have a specific interest you'd like to work in, language deprivation, education, access, whatever subcategory it is, there is a group for it, and you can join that. Whatever area interests you and whatever area you're at. So they do have focus groups and they also have general groups uh, and leadership as well, opportunities. So we need to share our experiences with others so that people can become more familiar and possibly also involved. Dr. Hattrick says the person asking the question seems to feel exactly like you do, and they want more people to be involved with the Poor People's Campaign with them. And I'm getting told we're right on the clock. We've hit time. Kari, we know you're in the East Coast. You're EST. We're a little bit past your bedtime. This is Kari. It's 10 p.m. now. It sure is. And this is Dr. Hattrick. Thank you so much, Kari, for your energy, for your presentation, for responding to our questions. Thank you for being present with us tonight. And we look forward to having you return for our future further webinar series. Thank you so much, Kari Cooke. And again, I want to thank everyone that joined tonight's program. I want to thank the interpreters working tonight as well. Thank you all.